Hello everybody. What I'm going to try to do in this video is show you what's going on inside your camera when you take a picture with regards to it determining how much light it needs to gather and how it needs to gather that light to make a well-exposed picture. This is a good thing to know whether or not your camera is used in its automatic mode or if you're controlling either its f-stop or its aperture. What I like to use is an analogy between filling up a bucket of water and what's going on in your camera. I think we'll all be able to understand it much better that way. In this first slide, assume that you've got a water faucet and you have a pipe or a hose coming from that water faucet and you want to fill up a bucket of a certain size. Now, depending upon how big your bucket is, you're going to have to water or keep your water on going through the pipe or the hose for some amount of time to fill up the bucket. If you put on a bigger hose or a bigger pipe, then you won't have to keep the water on so long. Also, if you make a real small pipe or use a real small hose on the end of your water faucet, it will take you longer to fill up a similar size bucket. So you can control how long it's going to take you to fill up the bucket by working with how long you keep the hose or the faucet on and how large a pipe you have going through the water going through to get to your bucket. As you can see here on the right, got a large pipe. Probably won't have to run the water so long as the small pipe here to fill up that same size bucket down here at the bottom. Okay, I think we can all understand that. Let's go now and take a look and compare what we see on the screen here to what's going inside your camera. There are three things that your camera controls in order to make a well-exposed picture when it's not too bright, when it's not too dark. Number one, the ISO, or how sensitive the camera is to light. When you set the ISO on your camera, the higher the number that the ISO is, the more sensitive your camera is to light, meaning you can take pictures when it's beginning to get dark or before it gets light in the morning without using your flash, for example. This is similar to when you went into a store and bought a box of film. Those boxes of film had large numbers on them, and you knew that if you bought one around 100 or 200, that would be the kind of film that you would buy if you were going to be taking pictures in normal lighting. And generally, if they were Kodak brand, the boxes were yellow with red printing on them. On the other hand, if you were buying film for your camera, then you would buy the boxes that had the higher numbers, 400 or 800. And generally, for a Kodak brand of film, the box had blue writing. Now, that ISO number is analogous, if you will, or is the same thing as the size bucket that you have to fill. If you have to fill a small bucket, that would be the same thing as using your camera in a situation where it is very sensitive to light and doesn't need much light, meaning higher ISO settings. On the other hand, if you have a large bucket, that means your camera is ISO-wise, that's a lower ISO number, and it would be like having to fill a larger bucket. Going up to the water faucet, how long you kept the water faucet on to fill up your bucket is the same thing or is analogous to keeping the shutter, the lens open for a longer period of time. The longer you have on the water, or the longer you leave open your lens, that's analogous to how long you keep the water on. It's called the shutter speed, and normally our shutter speeds are measured in just fractions of a second. However, they could be much longer. The size of the pipe in our water analogy is how wide your lens opens up. It is called lens aperture, or the aperture of your lens. The larger the lens is opened, the more light gets in for a given amount of time that you keep it open. Now, we measure the aperture in something called f-stops. Now, there's a very precise meaning to f-stops that I won't worry about telling you about here. But the smaller the f-stop number, the larger the lens opening. The smaller the lens opening, the larger the f-stop number is. For example, a small f-stop number, say f2.8, means the lens is opened very large. It's a large opening. On the other hand, a small f-stop number, like f8.9 or f11, that is a small lens opening. So, for the same amount of light that your camera has to capture, and you have a small lens opening like f11, you're going to have the shutter open a longer amount of time in order to gather enough light to make a well-exposed picture for that ISO setting that you've set your camera on. Now, if you have your camera set on a low ISO number like 100, it's like having a larger bucket that you need to fill. If your camera is set on a higher ISO number, maybe 1600 or 3200 even, that would be analogous to only having a small bucket you have to fill. And once your camera does in automatic mode, when it's on automatic, it's playing those three factors off against each other to come up with the right combination, meaning it sets ISO, the aperture, that's measured in f-stops, and the shutter speed. Now, there are two settings on your camera that you'll see on the dial. Normally on the dial, if you'll see an A, but I'm talking about the dial on top of your camera if your camera is set up this way. An A means and stands for aperture preferred. That means that you, the photographer, select the aperture, the lens opening you want, how large you want it opened, and then the camera, based on whatever ISO has been selected, will adjust the shutter speed in order to take the picture that is well exposed. That is called aperture preferred. There is also an S or a TV on your dial on top of your camera. That stands for shutter preferred. In that case, you, the photographer, decide how long you want the lens to stay open, and then the camera, for that ISO that you have set, will adjust the aperture or how wide the lens is open so that you get a well-exposed picture. Now, there's reasons why you as a photographer want to either use aperture preferred or shutter preferred way of taking your pictures. We won't go into that here. I just want you to understand and see aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, how they work together and how they relate to the water bucket analogy to take your pictures. Oh, there's one more letter on the top of your dial that is relevant to this discussion. That's the M. M stands for manual. In that mode, you, the photographer, set the aperture and the shutter speed. And then for a given ISO that you have selected, the camera's going to take the picture. It may be too dark or it may be too bright, depending upon how well you've set that. So this is what it's all about, to set your camera into these various modes: aperture preferred, shutter preferred, and the ISO too. It's those three things that work together. And it's just like whenever you're a little confused about that, go back to the water bucket analogy. The bucket is the ISO, the size of the pipe, or the diameter of the pipe, is the aperture, and how long you keep the water on is the shutter speed. Hope this helps a little bit. You might have to play it a couple times to really get it, and what you really need to do is practice with your camera, taking pictures with these various modes. We'll do a little of that in class, or you can practice that on your own. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you later.